Welcome everybody to this webinar. This webinar is about domestic abuse related deaths. That's homicides and suicides in later life. The topic is highly emotive, it's highly sensitive, so please ensure that you are sitting or viewing in a safe space. My name is Carrie Bauer and I am the training lead here at Hourglass. Hourglass is the only UK-wide charity dedicated to ending the abuse of older people. We cover all 4 nations and we have a 24-hour helpline and an advocacy service, a policy and influencing team, and we deliver training. So today's webinar, I have some guest speakers with me who will be talking about this topic. I have Hannah, who is Deputy CEO at AFTER. AFTER is Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, a charity dedicated to supporting bereaved families. I also have Lafleur. Lafleur is an advocate working for AFTER and she specialises in working with older relatives. I also have Tim Woodhouse. Tim is a suicide prevention manager, but also a Churchill Fellow, and he's going to be talking about his research. And I have Maggie, who is Director of our frontline services, so the helpline and our team of advocates and frontline services officers. So before we get started, just to give you some context, today is day 1 of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. It's also White Ribbon Day. Hourglass support any victim survivors of domestic abuse and all forms of abuse who are aged 60 and above, men and women. But today we will be focusing on women. This is a really important conversation. We know that data that's emerging tells us that 73% of all victims of a domestic abuse related death are women. 26% of them are aged 55 and above. And if you are a mother, according to the femicide census, you are more likely to be killed by your son than you are a stranger. So whilst we do support all older people of all genders here at Hourglass, today is heavily focused on women. So first of all, Hannah, could you tell me a little bit about Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse and the work that you do to support older bereaved relatives?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Carrie. So as Carrie said, Advocacy After Fatal Domestic Abuse, or AFTER as it's known for short, we are an independent charity that was founded back in 2008 by the founder and chief executive, Frank Mullane, following the tragic murder of his sister and nephew by her estranged husband. The remit of the charity is quite broad, but it's largely to support families and friends who have lost loved ones as a result of domestic homicide, suicide, as well as unexplained deaths following domestic abuse. Over the past nearly 20 years, we've supported hundreds of families through statutory review processes to ensure that the voice of the victim is heard really clearly within those review processes. Our advocacy team is an incredibly skilled and knowledgeable group of people that are there to provide that practical support to families who are looking to really make sense of what's happened in this particular incident. Alongside the advocacy service, we are also a centre of excellence in relation to statutory review work. So we also run training for domestic homicide review chairs, for local authority areas and partners, and that's to ensure best practice within these reviews and ensure that families and loved ones are really central to that review process. And that also includes the voice of children. And that's where our advocacy team really excel at supporting those families. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Lafleur, who's going to tell you a bit more about the advocacy team, as Lafleur is one of our more experienced advocates. Lafleur.
So with our advocacy team, it's kind of split off into different interests. So we all have a specialist area. Some of our team have social workers, some of us have a legal background like myself, and that's how it's kind of filtered off. So I support older bereaved family members, and I also support the family members of those who have lost older family members. So it's both sides of the coin. So if we're really looking at some of the cases that we have, it varies. So we deal with parricide cases where it may have been a child that sadly murdered a parent. We deal with also suicide cases and homicide and unexplained deaths. And some of the things that we have found is that a lot of our older victims fall under the unexplained death category, because for some reason, some of the things that they face aren't always seen as abuse, although they are. Neglect, that's abuse, financial and economic abuse. But for some reason, what we're trying to do at AFRA is trying to get agencies to recognise that this is still a form of abuse and it falls under that. So that's just some of the things that we kind of see. If you want me to share kind of cases and things like that, we can discuss that later on, and I can kind of give you some examples of some of the things that we see and deal with.
Thank you, Lafleur. And yeah, we know that kind of the data that we have is very, very limited for older victim survivors of domestic abuse more generally. So that's likely to correlate to those domestic abuse related deaths, aren't they? They will be the tip of the iceberg. There will be a lot of deaths that are recorded as natural causes or unexplained that we do not know about. And this kind of research and data is really in its infancy in terms of what we know. But in terms of the people that you support, particularly those relatives of an older victim, are there any particular themes that you see?
Yeah, especially in the kind of domestic homicide review process, now known as a domestic abuse related death review. We kind of seen patterns such as, I've written some things down here, agencies failing to ask direct questions and to kind of speak to the victim privately, kind of taking them away from their carer or partner to kind of speak with them. We see dependency, as a risk factor, that sort of thing. Also, in some of the cases that I've dealt in with the recommendations, agencies sometimes fail to recognise non-physical harm as a red flag. So that's something that's kind of shone through with a lot of the families that we've supported. Also we see things such as, a need for there to be training among professionals, because sometimes we can have an age bias and not actually know. That kind of changes how we may interact with, the service users that we support. So that's something that's also shone through, and also including advocacy specialist support. A lot of the support out there isn't really tailored to the older demographic, and also some of the things families have shared as well, that their loved one felt very isolated and almost felt that, the family have said it's kind of like a generation thing sometimes. People say things such as, oh, they've been together for years, or family members have said, well, we knew about it, but we kind of got used to it because they've been together for so long, things like that. So it's really about really raising awareness and challenging professionals to really look deeper and have that professional curiosity to really look beyond what they're seeing before them. And that's it, really.
Thank you, Lafleur. And certainly, if we think about it, coercive controlling behaviour in England and Wales has only been a criminal offence, hasn't it, for 10 years? So if you're thinking about somebody in their 70s, 80s and 90s, this is all very new. And actually, some of our laws normalised some of those behaviours. So we have to understand kind of where people are at and meet them where they're at in terms of the support that we provide. But also that means family members, loved ones, friends, peers will also carry some of that ageist bias, but also some of that normalisation. So it is really complex. And this is why we very much feel at Hourglass that we need that specialist lens in terms of the needs of older people, because it's so systematic, isn't it? And so entrenched, some of these belief systems amongst society, that it's very, very hard to spot. And we haven't even been counting people till very, very recently in the data. So Maggie, you've been working in this sector for a very long time. Maggie's been with the charity well over 20 years. And I know more recently we've started to become involved as expert panel members for domestic abuse related deaths. That's quite new. It's only been the last few years, but you've sat on 8 of those, haven't you, so far? What have been the themes in terms of the suspect in those DADAs, as we call them?
So, of course, in terms of suspects, what we're not seeing, or what I'm not seeing when I'm on the panels, is it's not partners. it's male adult children, and that is the common theme that I'm seeing across the board. And that links in, of course, to the data we see with the femicide data census as well, and domestic abuse related deaths more generally. So what people think is domestic abuse and partners, and it's not what we see with older adults. And there needs to be more information out there, and there needs to be more awareness of what we're seeing.
Thank you. Thanks, Maggie. And Lafleur, in terms of, so I've obviously asked you about the older victims,
Yes.
but you've also, as you said, your role is twofold. You support older relatives as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And can you tell me a little bit more about that? Because, you know, that will come with its own unique challenges.
Yeah.
Can you talk to me about that, please?
So some of the themes that I kind of see in the older bereaved family members that I support is, you know, sometimes they blame themselves
Yeah.
for what happened. There's a decline in their mental health and physical health. You know, they often become caregivers to their grandchildren overnight, you know, just like that. And that's a big transition. And a lot of them, you know, we're talking some 70 plus raising 11-year-olds, for example, and that really can't be easy, that transition, you know. Fractured family relationships, you know, financial strain. They actually do become quite isolated because no one else can really relate to their story and their journey. So that's another thing that we see, you know, they often feel forgotten and unseen because there's other processes that come along with that trauma and that grief, and that's, you know, the domestic homicide review process. You know, sometimes there's a SAR process ongoing, there's inquests, and these are all new things to them. And it's finding the way to kind of give them support and navigate a system, a really complex system that doesn't always give them the results and, you know, the real answers that they're looking for. Some of the other things that we see, you know, even when families kind of raise some of the issues with agencies, it's still, I'm not really seeing that much of a receptive response to that. And it's really important to remember that these families play an integral part in bringing about the change. And, you know, that's kind of what I see there.
Thank you. Yeah, and something we don't often think about is we are talking about bereaved relatives, but also bereaved relatives, like you say, that now may well be caregivers to bereaved children. So it's that whole family approach, really thinking about, and we often notice we talk a lot about children being the forgotten victims, and rightly so, but we often forget about older relatives, don't we, in that conversation. Before we move on to Tim and your research, I don't want to assume that everybody that's here today understands what a domestic abuse related death is. We've moved the language has shifted from domestic homicides to domestic abuse related deaths. Hannah, could you just explain to attendees the differences and why that change has come about?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has come about largely from the voice of families that are being supported within these reviews, because the domestic homicide review is quite inaccurate when you have an unexplained death or a suicide. And that can be very confusing for families because you're constantly referencing a homicide, which is not accurate. It's also to recognise that we are conducting these reviews with that broader lens. So it's taking into account all of the deaths that have resulted as a result of domestic abuse. So domestic homicide review is now going to be known as the domestic abuse related death review, just so that it's much clearer in the remit that it's covering. And that's due to other legal changes as well, and the new guidance that's been formed through things like the Domestic Abuse Act 21 and also the new Victim and Prisoners Act that came in 2024.
Thanks, Hannah. And so that leads me on to you, Tim. Tim, you've been researching the link between domestic abuse and suicide since 2018. You've recently published a fascinating report called "The Person Most Likely to Kill a Victim of Domestic Abuse is Themselves." Now, that lists 66 recommendations, and I am not going to ask you to tell me every single one of them, but can you just give me a bit of an overview of the main findings, please?
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And thanks for the invitation to be with you today. I guess you're right. I started looking at this in 2018 based on the conversation that I had with some colleagues at work, where I work in the Kent County Council's public health team, just about the prevalence of domestic abuse related suicides. So I come from a suicide prevention angle. I'm not a domestic abuse expert. And somebody just asked me, in light of the changes that Hannah just mentioned in terms of DHRs now, or domestic homicide reviews, being expanded to include deaths by suicide as well, there was a simple question: Tim, how many domestic abuse related suicides are there that we should be preparing for these reviews? And I said, I don't know, but I'll go away and do some research, and I'll come back to you in a couple of weeks. Well, as you said, that was 2018. We're now 2025, and I still couldn't give you an accurate answer across the whole country about how many domestic abuse related suicides there are. However, the work that we've done in Kent and Medway has shown that I think the official estimates of domestic abuse related suicides are vastly undercount what is really happening in the real world. So over the last number of years, I've worked with Kent Police, who sadly count the number of tragic suicides that have been impacted by domestic abuse. And we know that about 33% of all of our suicides in Kent and Medway have been impacted by domestic abuse in some way, shape or form. If you extrapolate that 33% figure that we're seeing in Kent and Medway to a national level, that would mean that there are 1,800 domestic abuse related suicides every single year, which far exceeds the official statistics from things like the National Police Chiefs Council. And I can't guarantee that what is happening in Kent and Medway will be replicated in England. So we do need a much better national way of calculating. But I'm sure that whatever the actual figure it is way higher, and probably very near that 1,800 deaths per year. That 1,800 deaths per year could be split up into two main groups. Half of those approximately are victims of domestic abuse who take their own lives, and approximately half of those are perpetrators of domestic abuse who also go on to take their own lives. We know that for victims of domestic abuse, the reasons why they end up killing themselves are very different. So we know that some people are convinced that they're going to be murdered by their perpetrator, and that's obviously a horrific situation to be in, but it's true. But then we also find, and this is probably more of an older person thing, that actually for some victims of domestic abuse, they've been putting up with the abuse for so long, they cannot find another way of making it stop, and they see that suicide is the only escape for them. And that might be because they've told friends, they've told family, they've told services about the abuse, and it just has had no effect. It's made no difference. The abuse is continuing. So we do think that there are some people in that situation who end up dying by suicide because they cannot see another way out. But we also know that actually for some people, the suicide attempts comes many months, many years, sometimes after the direct abuse has stopped. And that's because we're only just beginning to understand about the long-term nature and the long-term impact of the trauma of being abused lasts for many months, many years. And so, yes, I think the main two findings are that the scale of abuse of DA-related suicide is much higher. The second main finding is that the reasons for victims taking their own lives is different. But if you allow me to do one final kind of main recommendation, I guess, is that we also know, and I spoke to many people during my research who are victims of domestic abuse, but whose perpetrator ends up killing themselves. Now, for some services, they might see that as, okay, well, the victim's safe now, so the abuse has stopped, and the victim's life would automatically be better now because the perpetrator is dead. And I think what my research shows is that that's not the case. And we know that when a perpetrator takes their own life, the emotional and practical mess that leaves behind for a victim can be horrific. And certainly reflecting back on what previous speakers have said, that in terms of older people abuse, and that if the abuse tends to be from an adult son, for instance, well, if it's the adult son that then goes on to take their own life, can you imagine as a parent what kind of conflicting emotions you must have, that the child that you brought into the world has taken their own life? So you must be in all sorts of unimaginable grief, and yet at the same time probably feeling quite relieved that the abuse that they were perpetrating against you has stopped in certain ways, forms. But actually, there may be other forms of abuse. So we know from some victims, they say that the perpetrator's death by suicide is the ultimate act of coercive control, because they know how it messes up the victim's life forever. So I'll stop rambling, but those are probably the three biggest findings from the report.
Thank you. No, it's really, really interesting. And like you say, the ultimate act of control, but all that internal wrestle and conflict. And for many people, the ability to talk that through with family and friends will be really impacted, won't it? Because often there's a narrative, and
Yes.
and sometimes people will feel compelled to kind of comply with that narrative because actually they don't want to speak ill of the dad, and possibly start to talk about what really happened. So often that can lead to kind of that internalization of trauma and that long-term impact. So as you say, sometimes these things have a long-lasting effect, but also for somebody who has made the decision to end their life as a form of control, actually that control can last for a long time, can't it? Particularly if there's been economic abuse and somebody is left in a situation where economically there's huge complications there.
Absolutely,
it's a real web.
Yeah, it's an emotional minefield and a practical minefield as well, in terms of the financial implications, some potentially housing situations, etc. And as you say, kind of relationships with other people in the family who either may not have known about the abuse, or who may believe the perpetrator if the perpetrator says that it was all the victim's fault, as often happens. So yes, it can really kind of leave a minefield behind, which means support services like AFTA, who do an amazing job kind of supporting families who have been bereaved, and other domestic abuse charities, and obviously Hourglass yourselves, being aware of that is really positive, because it means that we can now shape the practical and emotional support to best meet the needs of those individuals.
Thanks, Tim. Maggie, in terms of, we talked a little bit about some of the main themes that you found with the DHRs that you've been involved in. What have been the majority of the recommendations? Because I know a lot of that has been around, well, I won't give it away because we've talked about it, but what are kind of three key recommendations that seem to be consistent throughout? Because we know lots of the recommendations are repeated across all domestic abuse related death reviews, but what specifically for the elder?
So what I've seen on all of the reviews I've seen in, and the recommendations that we're putting out there, is we need to consistently raise awareness of this issue of domestic abuse in later life. And it's not just for victims and survivors who can't see themselves in a lot of things like campaigns that are out there because they're targeted to a younger generation, but also for family members to be educated as well in what domestic abuse is and how to recognise it, as well as professionals and the general public. So we need to have that more awareness of what is domestic abuse in later life and what does it look like. We also consistently see that risk assessments, are also a constant theme. And what's happening is they're being identified as low level. And when actually the risk is so much higher, and often, it's high levels of coercive control that is going on, but it's not being picked up by professionals. And the third thing we see more exactly commonly right across all of them again is communication and information sharing across organisations. Yes, we do have multi-agency meetings. Yes, we do have MARICs, but there continuously seems to be a misunderstanding of GDPR, and that safeguarding concerns can and should override GDPR, but we keep on seeing this reported again and again when there's knowledge that's not been shared, that actually if they've been shared at that point amongst the agencies, the thing could have gone in a different direction.
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, it's really interesting that, and particularly that reference to what's often described as low-level abuse, as you said, and we all know, actually can be a real indicator of complete power and control. A look, a word, a gesture can be all it takes for that victim survivor to know that there might be a consequence. And for many, many older people that we'll have been working with, this could be decades and decades of learning how to keep yourself safe. It won't be obvious to professionals. It'll be very, very difficult to spot. But we have to remember the context at which we, all of us as members of society, hold our own bias, our own ageist views, don't we? Those kind of, like we say, you know, we talk about traditional relationships. It's always been this way. All of these kind of internalized messaging that we all get, we all receive it. And we can often project that onto what we see. We don't ask those questions. We're not professionally curious enough. And that means that people go unmissed, and particularly an older person that maybe, as you said before, Tim, may have reached out over a period of time and had the door shut.
Yeah.
That's so much more challenging to then reach out again. And it's important that anybody, wherever touch point you have with an older person, you're reaching in, you're thinking the unthinkable and asking those questions, because actually for many people reaching out won't have been safe, but there won't have been options for many people who've been subjected to domestic abuse over a very, very long period of time. Tim, in terms of your recommendations, there were 66. Are there any that are particularly poignant to older people?
Well, I think where I was just going to come in on that point about risk assessments actually is one of probably the biggest recommendations that I had, because I think that it's really disturbing, isn't it, that the stats now show that the person most likely to kill a victim of domestic abuse is themselves, and yet as a society, most of the domestic abuse sector's response, or even society's response to domestic abuse, is right. How do we keep this person safe from the perpetrator? Let's do a risk assessment about the risk of the perpetrator killing the victim. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. We need to do that. We need to do it better. We need to invest more. We need to give it more time and energy. However, there are more victims of domestic abuse killing themselves than being killed by their perpetrator. So in addition to putting time, energy and money into keeping them safe from their perpetrator, my biggest recommendation is that we need to put time, energy and money into keeping victims of domestic abuse safe from suicide. And the biggest thing that you need to know in order to do that effectively is whether that victim of domestic abuse is considering suicide. And how do you find that out? You ask them. It's not rocket science, but it's not happening at all, or very, very little across the country. So my biggest single recommendation in the report is to ask every single victim of domestic abuse, are they considering suicide? Because without knowing the answer to that, you're not going to be able to do the next recommendation, right? Which is to ensure that every single domestic abuse safety plan that we put together for a victim, as well as all the sections that are in there now about keeping them safe from the perpetrator, it also needs to include a section about how to keep them safe from suicide as well. And that shouldn't be just about, just this one particular person giving me cause for concern. It should be routine. It should be everyone. So the phrase routine inquiry has been around for a long time in domestic abuse. Yes, we should absolutely be inquiring about domestic abuse in every kind of connection we have. However, we also need to be asking about suicide as part of that routine inquiry.
Yeah, and that's interesting because certainly, thinking about older people, the majority of older victim survivors will be in contact with not necessarily specialist domestic abuse services. We know the contact is really low. About 4% of all users are age 60 and above. So where do older people have contact? They have contact with health services, with social cares, with community services, with pharmacists, with their friends, with members of the public, the workplace. Many people are still in work later in life. We need to think about them in the context of employment as well. So there's lots of opportunities to reach in and ask those questions, and those questions about suicidal thoughts, but we're not even asking those questions around domestic abuse. And I know certainly in younger life, if we have contact with sexual health clinics, antenatal care, postnatal care, anything like that, particularly women are asked these questions now. They are routine. They are, things are getting better in that space. If we go and have a menopause check, or we're going for our over 70 health check, or we're in hospital following a fall, are these questions being routinely asked? And I would say no. Certainly in my experience working as a social worker, we weren't asking these questions. So the questions about suicide are even less likely to be asked. So this is something that we've got to really normalise in the conversation. And it's really in its infancy, isn't it, in terms of where we're at with older people. And often we have to meet them where they're at and speak the language. We also have to recognise the term domestic abuse is still quite new, certainly coercive control. This is language that many people won't recognise. In terms of, from an intersectional point of view, older people are not a homogenous group. They're not defined purely by their age. We all hopefully get to age, don't we, if we're fortunate. And the majority of us will age well and will live happy, lovely lives. But many older victim survivors face double, triple, quadruple jeopardy because of intersectionality. In terms of the data, I was having a quick look at the vulnerability knowledge practice programme, so the 4-year. Now, I've not analysed this in great detail, so do forgive me if I am wrong, but it's starting to emerge that there is a disproportionate figure in terms of adult family member deaths in the Asian and Black communities. And I just wondered if anybody had any thoughts on that. I think there's more that we need to know about different groups, many different groups that are marginalised. But certainly I noticed that looks quite disproportionate in comparison to intimate partner deaths. Does anybody have any experience or thoughts on that? It's a bit of an open question if anybody does. And I'm more than happy to take it away.
I would say, they fall under kind of the category of what we call intersectional invisibility. So it's kind of, let me give an example. Not only are they an older survivor victim, how you put them, but for example, an older woman, again, the intersections are multiple for those within that demographic. So you have age, you have their gender, possibly health, disability, and then you have to take into consideration the ethnicity. So it intersects across all things. So if I'm talking from Black or minoritized women, for example, there will be barriers there. For example, we have to take into consideration the culture and belief, the lack of trust in agencies, sometimes agencies not representing the people themselves, that sort of thing. So those can be kind of a barrier, but I think it's for all older women, really, they all fall under intersectional invisibility.
Thank you, Lafleur. And certainly the data's telling us that at least, and it's probably more, 50% of all older victim survivors of domestic abuse have a long-term health condition or a disability. It's likely to be much higher than that. And the question is it the disability or the long-term health condition that creates a vulnerability? I would argue it's probably domestic abuse that caused the disability or that long-term health condition. But again, we need more research, don't we? More analysis on this, because we know actually there are a number of conditions that we now know are directly related to behaviours that harm. So non-fatal strangulation, suffocation, head injuries, broken bones. All of these can actually create symptoms and health conditions which are often assumed to be age-related. Stroke, memory loss, incontinence, cognitive impairment, word-finding difficulty, fractures, bruising. Often, we're not asking those difficult questions that we might ask if that person was 20 and found at the bottom of the stairs. Would we ask, have you been pushed if they're 85, or would we assume they've fallen? And we don't know. You know, these are those sort of questions that we need answering and more research. Hannah Lafleur, did you want to add anything to that?
I'll let Hannah go first.
Oh, thank you, Lafleur. It got me thinking about that power dynamic, as you say. Power and control is at the root of all of this. And if we think about older adults and the reliance on loved ones for care and the dynamic that creates, very often the opportunity to have these conversations that we're suggesting that should be happening are not possible, because there is an element of gatekeeping. As you say, where there's disability, we often make somebody invisible. We talk to their carers, we talk to their family members, we don't talk directly to them. And the opportunity to be alone with that person is often very limited too. So it's even more important when we talk about professional curiosity to actually look beyond the situation we're presented with, because this is why we see in our DHRs over and over again domestic abuse being badged as an adult safeguarding issue that is then responded to in a completely different manner that doesn't actually detect the risk that people are facing. So I just wanted to add that, really. Thanks.
Thank you. We often get that reframing of carer stress, don't we? And people want to naturally go to that easy, simplistic explanation, but actually, is it carer stress? Do we need to look beyond what's presented in front of us? Lafleur, did you want to add something?
Yeah, this kind of falls into a case that I was working on. This DHR has been published now, so I can speak about this. Okay. This was a case of a 76-year-old Romanian woman who was sadly, well, it was put down as an unexplained death, but you know, I'll let you decide on what you think it was. Now, she presented to the A&E department multiple times with broken bones, fractures. The last one before her death resulted in her needing a hip replacement. Now, she didn't speak English, and a member of staff suspected abuse, but due to the language barrier, didn't feel the need to escalate this, okay? She was later found deceased in her home. She was married for 40 years. The home was found to be in a great condition. Now, it did meet the criteria for a domestic homicide review because the children did say that there was a history of abuse. But if we look at this case deeper as professionals, we could see what could we have done differently to stop this from happening. Now, the one thing would be to look at why she presented multiple times to the A&E department with fractures, you know, not using language as a barrier as to why you can't risk assess and probe further. Also looking at, you know, the care needs, what's going on in the home, you know, that sort of thing. So that really kind of opened up my eyes of how forgotten, you know, this age group really is. Yeah.
I can see that the chat is really busy. I'm going to continue asking a few more questions, but if any of you attendees have questions for the panel, please use the Q&A section, because there's lots of you. We've got 231 people here now. I will not be looking at the chat at the moment, so I will be looking only at the Q&A. So if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A and not in the chat. Thank you, Lafleur. So moving on, Tim, any other thoughts? What you are continuing your studies now, so could you tell me a little bit more about what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been really lucky to have been given the opportunity to just start a PhD on domestic abuse related suicides at the University of Kent. So I will be specifically looking at why female victims of domestic abuse as well as male victims of domestic abuse may end up taking their own lives. So looking at that gender split, you were absolutely right at the start of this webinar to say that we know that women are far more likely to be high risk, high harm victims of domestic abuse. However, far more likely isn't 100%. We know that there are male victims out there, and we also know in the general population, so if you remove domestic abuse, men are far more likely to kill themselves than women when you look at the suicide stats. So when you bring those two topics together, and you've got male victims who are smaller in number of high risk, high harm, but actually more likely to die by suicide anyway, we see that reflected in the stats that actually we are seeing quite a lot of male victims dying by suicide, probably more than you would expect, given that we know there are far more women and females who are high risk, high harm victims of abuse. So that's what I want to be looking at in my PhD. But I'm also going to be looking at these other elements of intersectionality as well. And I won't be able to cover them all in one PhD, but I think there's so much more that needs to be done. So we've already heard, this whole topic of safer aging in itself is one. So we don't really understand what the age breakdown is at the moment of these people who are dying by suicide after domestic abuse. We just don't have that as a country. So I'll be campaigning, I'll be doing what I can with the information that we've got in Kent Medway, but also campaigning nationally to the Department of Health to start collecting this data and providing age breakdowns and providing ethnicity breakdowns, providing disabilities. And then let's look at all of those kind of overlaid on top of each other and work out. And that's just kind of the demographic kind of intersectionalities. Well, what about the different elements of abuse? So we know, for instance, we've talked a lot already about financial abuse and physical abuse. We haven't really talked so much about sexual abuse, but I bet it happens in older people as well.
Very much, yeah.
Coercive control, absolutely. How do they all interplay with the risk of suicide? So is coercive control, does that carry a greater suicide risk in older people than financial abuse? We just don't know because we haven't done that research yet. I'll be doing as much as I can within my PhD, but also trying to encourage others up and down the country to investigate their particular topics of interest as well.
Thank you, Tim. And something in your report that I really took away with, and it really left me thinking for quite a while. I remember going on dog walks, just always thinking about two words. It was "and also."
Yes.
And I'll just read out something from your report, and it really stayed with me. And you said, "It is not the case of either or, it is the case of yes and also." And I thought about three, and we could talk about lots of different groups here, and we should absolutely. But women and girls, and also men and boys, victim and survivors, and also those who harm young people and children, and also older people. It is not an either or, is it? It's an and also. And you know, that list could go on and on and on. It's a very readable report. I have to say, for such a difficult topic, it's very, very readable. Hannah, in terms of campaigning, I know that AFTA have a campaign at the moment. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is sort of segueing in from what Tim is saying and the important research that is going on around this particular issue, because it's broad, as we say, it's nuanced, it's affecting all parts of society, it's intersectional. What happens then once we've identified all of these deaths that were preventable? What AFTA are currently looking at is the need to start a debate around the current laws where we aren't potentially holding people accountable, where there are deaths occurring as a result of domestic abuse. Obviously, there doesn't have to be a murder for there to be a loss of life, and that's what this campaign is really a call for change, really. What we're trying to do is understand how we can make people more accountable where there are deaths by suicide that are linked to domestic abuse, because the problem we've got with the current law and the legislation, we know with coercive controlling behaviour, it's incredibly difficult to prove in court. It's very difficult to prove the link of causation, which is at the core of all of our criminal justice. And then we know the maximum imprisonment for coercive controlling behaviour is 5 years. You could potentially look to pursue a manslaughter charge, but again, that you're looking at really difficult causation. And again, often you will find sentences will be under 9 years for that as well. So there feels like there's a real gap. And what we see is that juries really struggle to make the link between historic domestic abuse and the causation of death following that. So what it will hopefully do is recognise those cases where there has been longer term psychological abuse that has led somebody to take their life as a result of what they've been experiencing. It's going to hopefully reinforce the existing legislation that I've just mentioned. So often we see in cases of coercive controlling behaviour, there will be assault charges, there will be other charges put into there, but they will often run concurrently if somebody is found guilty of something. So it's going to hopefully allow us to go above and beyond what we've achieved so far with the coercive controlling behaviour laws. And ultimately, it's hopefully going to increase convictions where people are responsible for somebody taking their life as a result of the abuse that they have inflicted over many years. So it's going to work in the sense of a public education tool, because actually we're really naming this as an offence in its own right, you know, to force somebody, to coerce them, to abuse them to the point where they take their own lives because they see there's no way out. It's about really sending a clear message, you know, to people that this is not tolerable, that this is abuse. And I think it also sets a precedent, as other laws have. If you think, we have a number of other laws in place. So if we look at acid attacks, it's a horrific, horrible incident that has its own specific legislation because of the fact that it is such a nuanced issue. We've got things about, you know, causing or allowing the death of a child, assisted suicide. These are all events where somebody has lost their life. It's been preventable, and we're recognising it in a court of law. And that's essentially what this campaign is all about. We're opening up a debate, first and foremost, about what could this look like for us? How could we ensure that we are creating opportunities for families and loved ones to seek justice where there is clear evidence? What I would say is domestic homicide reviews, we always see them as kind of the very end point of a very tragic set of circumstances. But actually, when they're done properly, they are a tool for change. They cut across the entire prevention, early intervention, all of that sort of narrative. You could use them for many ways of learning. So what we're seeing at the moment is that domestic homicide reviews are starting to inform the coronial process. So we've got coroners for the first time considering what we're finding in these domestic homicide reviews, which is wonderful, because that's where families are really being given a voice, where if there has been criminal justice proceedings, or in the cases of suicide and unexplained death, where there hasn't been any process to really unpick what's happened, that's incredibly beneficial for families who are trying to grieve and make sense of what's happened. So it's a really influential time to really start talking about this. If we're going to recognise what is a significant issue for us around domestic abuse and suicide, we almost certainly have to look across the board at the criminal justice process as well. So thank you. We do have a report, which I'm sure we're going to be able to share with you all as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and keep an eye out on that. But yeah, we can certainly share that as well. Maggie, before we go to the questions, can you just tell us a little bit about the work we do at Hourglass in terms of our 24-hour helpline, but also the advocacy service that we offer people?
So we run a 24/7 helpline, which we do instant message, text and email. So with the 24/7 helpline, it's not only survivors and victims that can call us, it's family members, it's professionals as well, to get guidance on cases where they might have questions around older people. Through our 24/7 helpline, that links into our casework, where we have trained IDVAs and ISVAs who work long-term, short-term with victims and survivors who are suffering domestic abuse. So the whole of the frontline services is geared to older people. First of all, the survivor victims, also to support family members, to give them options, to give them advice, to give them information. Where can they go? Where can they get support? And like we said, for professionals as well, when professionals come to us, we will give advice on cases from high risk, medium risk down to low risk cases. And then through our advocacy work with our IDVAs and ISVAs, they've been specially trained in, and we have worked with older people for the past 30 odd years. Older people have fed into what we do here. So all of our staff that work across the front line have all been trained in older people abuse, and as well as domestic abuse.
Thanks, Maggie. Thank you. So we'll go to the first question. Let the speakers just have a moment while I have a read through them. And there's quite a few here. So I will get started with a statement and then a question. And actually, if I've got any colleagues who are attending that can answer this, feel free to chip in on the chat, because some of this it will be a bit of a team response. So one statement is, a concern I think is underestimated in domestic abuse perpetrators who end up in caring roles for older family members, and there is no way of this being identified. You're quite right. Is there any research on this? So the research is very limited. I just want to remind attendees, for those of you that don't know, the Crime Survey for England and Wales has only been collecting data on all older people when it comes to rape, sexual assault and domestic abuse for the last 3 years. We are in our infancy in how much we know about the scale of the problem. So many of us working in this sector can give anecdotal evidence, but we don't actually have a lot of data, and without data we don't have a lot of research. I know Safe Lives had a spotlight report back in 2016 that focused on older people, but I'm not sure if there is any specific research in this area. So if anybody knows of any, please do post that in the chat. But do any of our speakers know of any? And it's okay to say no. I think it speaks volumes, doesn't it, actually, that we don't know the answers to that question. Bridge Carter, who I know that name very well, who really speaks a lot and does a lot in this space. She is asking you, Maggie, a question directly. It's, in your frontline work, how common is it for older victims to be dismissed as confused, depressed, or just struggling with age, when in reality the root cause is coercive control or long-term psychological harm? And how do we challenge that age-based bias in frontline responses? Well, I will happily answer this question, but it's directed at you, Maggie.
Yes, I mean, what we see is a lot of unconscious bias quite often with organisations when they've gone out to incidents and an older person is traumatised because of the incident that has happened. But actually what they put on the report is the person seemed confused. The person seemed to have memory issues. Well, they're bound to have maybe feeling confused or have memory issues because their son or daughter or their partner has just hurt them. So they may not be thinking straight, but because of their age, it has been put onto the referral that we get. It is because they seem to be having memory issues. They seem confused about, their statements. Well, they might be because they're actually in trauma from what has happened, but they're making these judgments and they're not professionals in a way of making their judgments. They're not able to, be assessed there for mental capacity by those individuals, but they do this. The way we have challenged is quite often looking at reflection, helps for a person to see where their bias is happening. We also look at professional and challenging about conduct and safeguarding. But what we need is training. Unconscious bias is there. It is in society, it's in professionals. But when we see this, it's not just challenging it, it's how can we prevent it? We should be having training around this. It should be embedded into what we do around domestic abuse.
Thank you, Maggie. We've got lots more questions, so I'll keep going. I don't know how many of these we'll be able to answer. One question is this being recorded? And the answer is yes, and you will receive the recording after the session. I'm going to skip that one just to give lots of different people a question. Do you support with supervision for professionals and support professionals nationwide, Melissa? We don't offer clinical supervision. That's not a service that we offer, but we are happy to receive queries and talk to professionals and certainly work alongside professionals, and that is across all 4 nations, so England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Do you think for the inquiry to include historic domestic abuse, or if the abuse has changed over time as the person has aged. Anybody want to take that question? I think that might have been a follow-on from another question. I mean, abuse does change through the life course. Certainly my experience, and this is anecdotal because we don't have a huge amount of research out there, is that often when working with older people much later in life, they will know what their perpetrator is capable of. They will know because they will have been subjected to it at some point during their life. And for many people, they will be modifying their own behaviour and keeping themselves safe the best way that they can. And that can be living a very, very limited life, very isolated, often following rules and rituals, avoiding consequences. And that can go on for a very, very long period of time. It could go on for decades. We often hear about separation being a trigger for that loss of control, where that high risk starts to escalate. We need to start thinking about other factors, particularly for those in later life. Think about retirement, redundancy. That can often mean victim, survivor and perpetrator are together more, can also mean a loss of status. Think about ill health. Ill health creates a loss of control, whether that's the victim, survivor or the perpetrator. It means more professionals are involved. And so these can all become catalysts for an escalation in risk. But actually, through that life course to an outsider and a professional, it might look like, as we described before, low-level abuse. It might not be obvious to our eyes. It might be a feeling, an instinct. But the victim survivor will probably be expert at knowing when the risk is escalating. So again, it's just thinking differently, isn't it? We're very focused on the obvious because of what we know, because we've been counting and researching certain demographics, but there's a lot that we don't know. I was getting on my soapbox there, so I'll go back to the questions. Tim, do you do any research around perpetrators of domestic abuse who die by suicide? I think you might have already answered this, but you feel free to.
Yeah, well, a little bit. So in the report, we do talk around some of the demographics of the perpetrators that die, but mainly we talk about the impact that they leave behind, and certainly a couple of the case studies in the report go into quite a lot of detail about the both the emotional and practical messes that the perpetrator suicide does leave behind. What I'm not planning to do in my PhD is to go into too much detail in the PhD, because just don't have time. And in terms of, I'd love other people to come forward and start doing other research projects around perpetrator suicide, because it's definitely happening way more than we thought it was. I think it's been the tactic of threatening suicide as a way of making a victim stay in a relationship, as a way of coercive controlling the victim has been known about for quite some time. But actually what we're starting to see now with the data that's coming out of Kent and other places is that it's not just an empty threat. Perpetrators are absolutely following through, which causes, as we've already discussed, kind of lifelong negative consequences for the people they leave behind.
Thank you, Tim. Ian, you've asked a couple of questions in regards to men, and I just want to be clear, here at Hourglass we support men and women, and we have had webinars specifically focused and dedicated to men. And you can look back if you go onto the Hourglass Safer Aging YouTube channel, they are there to view. And we do that. This week, I am going to male survivors in Manchester. I'm also speaking at a Mankind event. So we do speak about this, but today is the beginning of 16 days of activism against gender-based violence with a focus on women and girls. So today is about women and girls, and I make no apologies for that. In terms of other questions, let's have a little look. Sorry, it's quite hard to manage all of these questions at once. It's great though.
Can I just, while you're looking though,
yeah, go for it.
Can I come back on Ian's point, because I think it is really important. I totally understand why today's focus is on women and girls. However, we as a societal response to this issue, we need to ensure that we do kind of focus on male victims as well. And that's not just male victims of female violence, but it's male victims of male violence. So Ian talks around sexuality and same-sex relationships as well. I think somewhere sexual orientation, yeah, and that's really important because we know it's one of those other intersectionalities that just often gets kind of ignored. Same-sex relationships, both female and male. It is one of those topics that I'd love to see more research on. I'd love to do it, but like about 300 PhDs, it would keep me going till long into my retirement. But you're right, and Ian, that there's so many different angles that we need to consider in society's response to this.
There is, and even at, Hourglass, none of us can do this alone. We need to collaborate and work together, and we need more people talking about this. So absolutely. And Ian, to your point, we know that the gendered nature of domestic abuse narrows with age. We're definitely seeing, we support, I think it's about 30%, maybe a bit more than 30% of the people that we support are men. And so please, me saying today is about women doesn't take away from the fact that we recognise older men, particularly in this space. But we are doing work on this. It's just not for today's webinar. Can Hourglass support victims who lack capacity? And that's we will work only with people with consent. So that doesn't mean somebody that has memory loss and dementia can't consent to working with us, but if they lack capacity to make that decision, then no, we can't work with them. But we can certainly give advice in terms to the professional or family member contacting us, and that probably would sit under a safeguarding response. We know there are challenges with that. There is definitely a need for more training and knowledge in those safeguarding systems. I've come from a safeguarding system, so I know that firsthand, and we recognise that there is a real need for more training, absolutely. And again, as we say, we're one organisation. We want to collaborate with more organisations in this space. I'm just going to have a look at this next one because I can see the OPFA qualification, and this is kind of my bag. What do you think of the OPFA qualification and supplementary questions to the DASH-RIC for older people of domestic abuse? So I deliver the OPFA, the 4-day OPFA for Safe Lives, and I know that there is probably somebody on this call, a wonderful Amanda Warburton-Wynne, who does the same thing for Safer Places. And she has developed at Cambridgeshire a specific older person's DASH risk assessment. I think that risk assessment and the research alongside it is excellent, and we should all be using it more. The challenge we have, particularly as a UK-wide charity, is that we're referring into numerous MARACs, and not all of them will accept that risk assessment. So that's half of our challenge, is that actually having this, you kind of want a consistent approach, but at the same time, some of those risk assessments need to be specific to the person that we're completing them for. So we rely a lot on professional judgment, but we know there's been lots of criticisms of the current DASH model. So the OPFA qualification is 4 days. It's very comprehensive, but again, training alone will not change this. It has to be, it's kind of systemic. I think the discussions we've had today show it's systemic, isn't it? Every single one of us, whether we're a member of the public or a professional working in this space, we all have to start having these difficult conversations and recognising, because for too long, older people haven't even been recognised in the conversation. Assumptions are often made that age is a protective factor, but it's just because we've not been counting people that we've not known the scale of the issue. We're starting to see the scale of the issue, but it is going to take years. Tim, I wonder if reaching out to local universities to explore interest in research projects could be a fab option to get more student awareness involvement. I am sure local unis would welcome research project ideas and possible external supervisors for PhD projects. You're smiling, so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in my late 40s, very, very late 40s, got about a week left of my 40s, and I did not expect to be starting a PhD at this stage of my life. But I've really grown my kind of links with the universities over the last couple of years, and you're absolutely right. Whoever sent that in, it's a really good way of kind of getting more stuff done. I'm currently supervising some medical school students at the Kent and Medway Medical School who are in their 4th year of undergraduate medical degrees, who are doing some research onto this that I'm supervising them with. I'm obviously doing my own PhD. There's a group of 6 of us around the country now who are doing PhDs on domestic abuse related suicides in, I think, 6 different universities. So there's a growing awareness of this subject of domestic abuse related suicides, and I'm hoping that will lead to kind of ever growing. But yeah, so I'm going to concentrate on the University of Kent and the Kent and Medway Medical School. But if other people want to reach out to their university and start pushing this as a topic for studies, then yes, please do that.
Thank you. Neil asks, given so few professionals are sufficiently informed on domestic abuse in older people, how to identify it and what support is available? Can anyone offer practical suggestions to better inform the public? Well, at Hourglass, we're trying our best, but we need your help. We need you to support the work that we do. I lead our training. We do deliver training. We're commissioned to deliver training across all sorts of different organisations, but we also have open access. We also have these free webinars every month. This is our last one for the year. We're going to have a break in December, but we are doing this work, but we do need your help. So if you can sign up to our newsletter, which will be in the chat, promote the work that we do, follow us on social media, share our insights. We have lots of policy briefs. Our policy team write. We've got one on ageism that's currently out, which I'm sure my colleague Andrea will share. Now that I've said it, she'll be busy trying to find it. We are doing this work, but we can't do it alone. We need to collaborate with organisations. We need support. But yes, we do deliver training. And as I said, I do work with other organisations. So Lime Culture, I deliver their ISFA training. We also deliver their older people's ISFA training. With Safe Lives, but we're really happy to collaborate with other training organisations as well, because actually we can't do, like I said, we can't do this alone. There's lots of work to do, and I know that there's many people on the call today who are really passionate about this topic too and are doing that work. So I think there is an opportunity here to collect and network, and this is we're still, even though Hourglass has been around for a long time, over 30 years, it still feels like we're in our infancy in terms of knowledge and people wanting to listen. So the fact that so many people have signed up today is really positive, because often it feels like we're screaming into the wind, into the void. And so that's really positive to start having these conversations. I'm going to have a quick look through to see if I've missed any questions, which I may well have done. Does anybody want to add anything before we go to the final few questions?
Yeah, I think someone had asked in the chat if there were any DHRs that could be shared. So I've just shared one in the chat, I think with Andrea, if you could share that, and that will take them to a case which is actually was a homicide and a suicide. So the perpetrator, he was in his 80s, and he did sadly take his own life afterwards. If they just have a look through, this is actually a firearms case as well. So I think they may be interested in that one. I've just shared it.
Interesting that you mention, whilst we're talking about that, a homicide, a domestic homicide followed by a suicide, I think it's quite interesting that during the COVID year, there was a report done by the VKPP, because it's such a long title, but it's the Vulnerability Knowledge Practice Programme, so it's specialist focus. They focused on older people. They've got a spotlight report. If you just put VKPP older people into a search engine, you will find it, and it's a really short report, But looking at some of their statistics during that COVID year, when looking at where the victim and the perpetrator, the suspect, were both aged 65 and above, so that sometimes the ages are categorised differently. They looked at that year, that COVID year, and then they looked at the 15-year national average, and they focused on intimate partner homicide followed by suicide. During that year, that number doubled compared to the 15-year average. Something was happening during COVID that created that pressure cooker. And if we think about the communication, the media coverage, and this is where media has a huge influence, doesn't it, on society? Think about what were the messages during that time for older people. We know that cases of domestic abuse increased during that time. There was a huge focus. What did it say to older people? What was the messaging? And it's a rhetorical question. I'm just going to ask you to think about that, because that did create an environment where those homicides followed by suicides increased. They doubled. That's pretty dramatic. And in that context, all of the victims were women, and all of the suspects were men during that period. I don't know about other periods, but for that period. So if you look at VKPP, older people, you will see a report that highlights some of those specific issues. At Hourglass, we are striving for a safer ageing by 2050. We know that's ambitious. 25 years seems a long time, but it's still very, very early days in terms of awareness, public awareness and professional awareness. And I just want you to all take a moment before we end today to consider and reflect on how old you will be in 25 years. I'm going to be 73 in 25 years. This isn't about other people. It's about each and every one of us. Each and every one of us could be a victim of domestic abuse. We could be a survivor. And it's important to reflect on, we all can be part of this solution, whether it's being involved professionally or raising awareness, talking about this topic, which is a difficult topic, sharing things on social media. So if you've reflected today and have some learnings, please share that on your social media channels or amongst your colleagues, and please tag Hourglass in. We really want to see the momentum and growing this conversation. World Elder Abuse Day earlier this year was about growing the conversation, and that's not just something we want to do one day of the year. We want to continue this conversation. And before we go, I can see lots of ages in the chat. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you start to stand in the shoes and think of your own life. If we're fortunate, we all get to age, and we all want to age well. I want to thank our speakers today. It's been an absolute pleasure. A really difficult topic, but I really appreciate how open you've been and how insightful you've been. I've learned lots from you. And I'm just going to remind people of that quote, Tim, because I think it's brilliant.